Okay, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning, Realty executives. Welcome to a wonderful office meeting. Today we have the absolute honor of bringing somebody from very, very far away. I think somewhere from Hollywood or LA County. The great thing about, as I was reading, I asked Mike to give me some pointers about Denise, since she's newer to our company, that she's been in the business 20 years. So I've been in business 20 years myself, so we're gonna go back a little bit to how short a contract was when we started, right? And if you, some of you remember, so it was only a couple of pages. You know, disclosures, it was only a few also. But now when you obviously print the contract, you automatically have all these kinds of things that you're wondering, how did this get added in here? How did this happen? So the contract has evolved. Obviously, Sue Happy, LA County, California. So we wanted to bring Denise to kind of give us her input on how she's been successfully for 20 years writing the contract. So please give her a strong round of applause. Come on, Denise Water. Tell us how it goes.
All right. All right. Well, thank you. I think I'm in position here. Great. Good to be here. Glad to be a Realty executive. Yes. So we're going to cover the contract today. The contract session is actually going to be divided into three because there's so much material. I went ahead and coordinated with Maricela some additional dates. So she'll be informing you when they come up, but we'll cover as much as we can today, and then we'll cover the others as time progresses. Is that a deal?
Awesome.
Okay, great. We'll be using a combination of slides and written material because this is just too much to put on the screen, and it's easier to just go point by point through the contract. So, the agenda for today, we're going to try to cover up to paragraph 9, which is page 4. I actually know that we're not going to make it quite that far because I chose to go ahead and address some of the addenda, etc. So we'll make some adjustments on that, but by the time we're done at the end of session 3, we'll have covered all the material. So that's all more stuff to come, a lot of material. So I'm going to put on my reading glasses because I've hit the stage in life where I can't see so well without it. So here we go. So let's just start on the title. So if you look in the package, we have it organized the way that the contract is in the ZipLogic. So the first document that you have is a disclosure regarding agency. The second document is possible representation of more than one buyer. And then the third document is where the California Residential Purchase Agreement starts. So that's where we're going to start on the contract. And then we'll reference back and forth between some of the other documents. Okay? So the first thing is, since at the top of the form we see California, so this form can be used anywhere in the state. The other thing that we see about this document in the title is that it's a joint escrow instruction. So way back when Leonel was talking about we started, there was no joint escrow instruction that was part of the purchase agreement. But now they actually do have that as part. So the instructions to escrow holder and the seller are on a particular page, and we'll address that. The form is intended for single family, and single family is a house or a condo, detached or attached. And then if you have multifamily, then you want to use the residential income property agreement. Now for single family, there's more than just the one for purchase agreements. There's more than just the one for single family. So this is just a quick note that if you have other types of deals, you need to consider using these type of documents. So if you have a person that passed away, if you're going to be representing the buyer, of course, then you want to use the form then that deals with probate. And then if you've got a mobile home, manufactured home, nowadays they are actually attaching them to the ground, but you probably want to use the mobile home purchase agreement. And then new construction, there's a lot of construction going on out there, so the new construction takes into account some of the disclosures that need to happen with those type of properties. Oh, and at any point ask a question. If I know the answer, I'll tell you. If I don't know the answer, I'll tell you I'll give the answer. But that's kind of the way it works. So yeah, I don't want to be talking all the time. I want to have some iteration, but we'll start this way. And if it's vacant land, then there's a form for vacant land. Now we're gonna refer fully to the handout. So, everybody's got that, the purchase agreement. So we'll just start at the top. So the date prepared, that's the date that the licensee, you, me, if you have a license, prepared the document. The reason why that date is typically used is because it's used to cross-reference. So a lot of times you'll see when you do the counteroffer or the addenda, you want to reference the date that it was prepared, because all the other dates, the date when the buyer signs, the seller signs, those fluctuate and the deal may not even go through. So that's the only date that's common between the documents, such that you have a common point of reference. This is an offer from the buyer. If it's one person, that's easy, it'll fit in the space. If you have more than one person and it carries over, then you may need to do the ASA form, which is for if you have multiple buyers, and it gives you additional seller addendum, an additional buyer addendum, so that then you can put all the extra names on there. So contractually, everybody that's part of the deal, you can see them. And that reference for the buyer, if you look, so we're on page 1, but if you flip back to paragraph 26, no, excuse me, paragraph 31 and 32. So that's on page 9 and page 10. So this is where the buyer signs the offer. At the bottom of page 31, you see that there's a box there at the very bottom, additional signature attached. So you'll check that box and then you'll add that form.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so that way you make sure everybody's addressed. The other thing that you could do is you could actually put it, and you can go to paragraph number 6, which is on page 2. You could actually also reference it there in the other terms. So you have choices on where to put it. If the buyer is a LLC, an entity, or a trust, then you also, because that is not a person, that's not a living being, there's going to be some people that are going to be signing for that. And those people, you need to know who they are. So the representative capacity document, that's what they would sign, that says that they have the ability to sign for that company. So if we go back to page 31, so again, and the reason why I'm cross-referencing, because this is where you're signing the documents, the buyer's signing, the seller's accepting. So this is where that becomes important. Even though we're on page 1 about the buyer, on page 9 at the bottom, we saw where there was a box to check if there was additional signatures. Well, above that, you'll see another box, and that's representative capacity, and -B is for buyer. So that means that you would want to have that form signed, so that then the buyer, if the buyer is an entity, then that buyer would notify, you would know who has signature authority for that. And then also they would request the respective documents for if it was a LLC or a corporation, for the formation of the corporation and those kind of things. So that's where it actually gets referenced back, but it's important up in the very beginning that we do that right. Anybody have any questions? I don't want to be boring standing here talking, so I'm going to make it where it's a little interactive. So I may ask somebody if they want to just chime in and give an answer. Or anybody had any situations where that created a problem for them?
Not yet.
No, not yet.
Okay.
I know that this wire fraud advisor, that's something new, right? Advisory?
Yes, because and I'll answer the question now. We'll address it more later. Yeah. At a point in time, the escrow companies were being compromised, escrow or title, were being compromised. So once the instructions went out, the third party would then send a new instruction saying, uh-oh, we messed up on that. You don't need to send it to this bank, send it to that bank. And that bank was that was fraud, because the buyer's money then was going to, not to the seller, not to the title company, escrow company on behalf of the seller. It was then going to the fraudulent entity. So they then start putting this wire fraud form in so that everybody knows be conscious if anybody's changes instructions midway of the deal, because that's not correct.
On that, I want to make a comment. There was a couple of people that called me to be aware of it. I got a friend of mine that called me and said that she had gotten 2 offers accepted. So imagine you get 2 offers accepted for your buyers, and the leasing agent says, okay, I'll accept your offer, send or wire your money to this particular escrow account, and that's a fraudulent escrow. So she was all of a sudden 20,000 in the hole for money from her clients. So that's what kind of where all of this comes from.
Yeah, so it's real, and it's difficult to get it back at that point. Yeah, so that's what we need to be mindful of. And I just had a client wire money in, and I thought, oh Lord, please let nothing go wrong in this situation, because it's too much for someone to try to recover. Okay. Okay, so we covered then the buyer, and then the property address. That's pretty simple. Just make sure you. I normally, when I get ready to write a contract, I go then and I go into the Realty system. For those of you who are licensed. That's the tax assessor's portion within the CRM, the MLS system that we use. And so then I normally go and pull up the property information at that time to make sure that I get the proper assessor ID number and the address, right? Virginia agrees, yeah. And then that way you make sure you know for sure you're buying what you intended to buy. Purchase price, straightforward, just whatever your client is going to offer. Close of escrow. I think most people do typically a certain number of days after offer acceptance. Anybody try to do the standard timeframe? Okay, predefined. Okay, very good. How about agency? That's the next part of the contract. So agency, we have on page 1, the first page of the disclosure regarding real estate agency relationships. And this page here, basically just this document, it just tells you the different types of agency relationships. It doesn't actually confirm what the agency relationships are. So in the case of if you're the listing agent, you then have to give a agency relationship form then to the seller at the time in which you're taking the listing appointment. Before you do any contractual documents, you want to give that disclosure to the seller to sign. And then for the buyer side, the buyer's agent gives one to the buyer, ideally as soon as possible once you start working together, but at the very latest before you write the purchase agreement. Okay, so that's what you want to do. And then because the seller doesn't know whether or not the agent really represents the buyer, then before the buyer's agent, before the offer is presented to the seller, the buyer's agent has to provide an agency disclosure to the seller. So what normally happens, there's 3 disclosures, agency disclosures that are actually in ZipLogic. The one that's attached to the form is the addendum number 2, which is the one that is from the buyer's agent to the buyer. And on that form, if you look on in section 2 there, paragraph 2, we just check off the information and sign the respective forms. So this is the buyer, the buyer's agent was signed here. And in the case where you see the box, if the listing agent, if it's not a dual agency, which means that the buyer and the seller are represented by the same brokerage, if it's not a dual agency and there are 2 different brokerages represented, then at the point in which the buyer's agent submits the offer to the seller, they would, and the seller submits the offer back, it would be signed by the seller in this section. So you can do it all in one form rather than 2. There's also a confirmation of agency form, and you can use that confirmation of agency form. Let's say you filled the purchase agreement out in the agency section. So if we go back to the purchase agreement, let's just say that you made a mistake. You didn't check a box or something went wrong there. Then what you have to do as part of the, you have to do a counter. If that was the only item that was only item that was a problem, then you'd have to do a counter, and in that counter you'd have a confirmation of agency document. And that document is a 1-page, and it just cleans up anything associated with that. So that's most of the time when it's used. Other than that, typically the agency disclosure form by itself would be sufficient, as long as all the proper parties are signed. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Am I boring you to tears?
No.
Give me some jumping jacks.
We're paying attention. We're paying attention.
Okay. And then the next section, 2C, potentially competing buyers and sellers. What that really does, and I had to go back actually to just make sure that I was on my game and I could present it properly. I actually went and I took a car course on the contract just to refresh everything and see what the latest and greatest was. And I like the way they presented this section on 2C because they said basically that's the overlap associated with brokerages. So we have the agency disclosure that actually addresses who you're representing. And then the PRBS for the potentially representing more than one. That's the overlap. So within a brokerage, you may have two agents that are bidding on that are submitted offers on the same property. So that means you're going to be competing against each other, and your buyer needs to know that. So that's the overlap within the brokerage. And the same thing on the seller side. If the seller then, if we have a listing for comparable properties, both of them are 5-bedroom houses, 2 baths, about the same condition, then the seller also needs to know that if we have that, both of those listings in the office, then they're going to be competing. So some of the buyers that might have come to that listing are now going to possibly go to the other listing that we have in the office. So that was the purpose of the form, to just let everybody know that yes, we are going to do our due diligence and represent you the best, but there are situations in which we can't control, in which there's going to be other people in the company that are going to be working for other clients that might impact your sale. Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right, financing terms. That's a good thing. Show me the money.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, show me the money. So for the initial deposit, that initial deposit is, typically that's going to be us. In the olden days, we used to get personal checks. Nowadays, the default is to do the electronic funds transfer. So, so that's good. But if you by chance do have a client that wants to use a personal check or some form of a check, then it's our responsibility. We can't accept a copy. We have to get the physical check because I guess I should say the proper consideration has not been given. You know, when you have an offer, you have a contract, you have to offer and consideration. So, so you need to make sure that you have that. And then if you do get a physical check, the other thing is trust fund log. Everybody know trust fund log?
Oh, yeah.
So,
Denise, can I speak on that?
yes, you may.
Hey,
Please
hey
help.
guys, we do not accept personal checks.
Okay.
And if you do get a personal check, do not make it to Realty Executives All Cities. We do not accept any personal checks. Cashier's checks, money orders made to Realty Executives All Cities. Please. If you're going to get a personal check, cashier's check, whatever, make it to the escrow, to whoever is doing dealing with the escrow. Okay, please, because we do not accept that here. The best thing to do is get the funds wired. Okay? All right, thank you.
Yeah, and in fact, speaking of wire, we haven't, unless someone else has had experience different, the industry has not gotten to the point yet where it'll do an ACH. It still requires the wire of the money, even when you, so that's the form of electronic funds transfer, not ACH yet. So, let's see. For 3B, increased deposit. So sometimes your buyer may just, they don't want to put a lot up. Maybe there's some particular condition that they want to be satisfied. Then at that point, they may say, you know, I'm going to increase my deposit. So if they increase the deposit, the one thing to note is the liquidated damages. The initial deposit is covered under the liquidated damage when you submit the, when you get the contract signed by the buyer. The increased deposit only gets covered under liquidated damages if you get that clause signed. So anybody who is representing a seller and you want to make sure your seller gets their proper amount of the liquidated damages if the deal goes awry, then you need to make sure that you have that clause included. And so for, you see it's car form RID. You see 3B at the end, car RID. That's the form that you want to use for any increased deposits. Because everybody's always talking about, Show me the money. All cash offers. Anybody submitted all cash offers? I know we have some investors in the group, et cetera. All right. They're becoming more commonplace, aren't they? Everybody seems to have money. Foreign buyers. Anybody deal with foreign buyers? Yeah, a lot of money coming in within the country and coming from outside the country. So for the all cash offers, when you check that box, then paragraph D, which says loans, basically that becomes non-applicable. So any contingencies associated with paragraph D and also with paragraph J. Whenever there's an all cash offer, those two become null and void. Okay. For loans, we have a variety of loan programs out there nowadays. But for a conventional buyer, FHA or VA buyer, I'm going to say those are the traditional ones if it's not cash. With the FHA buyer, then you know that there's going to have to be a disclosure associated with the FHA. If you don't submit it, then normally the lender's loan docs are going to come in with that mandatory clause to make sure that we have what we need to protect the buyer. Same thing with the VA. And then also for the interest rate, you can tell me what you guys practice is, but normally you want to put in maybe a max interest rate and then leave the rest to fluctuate. Because the market does shift, unless they have a rate lock. Still, you want to leave yourself that flexibility. Anybody have any experiences where that didn't work out well for them? The other thing is, for which we're going to deal with later, but of course everything has timelines associated with it. And so with the loan, ultimately the loan contingency, the default is 17 days for that. And so we need to be mindful because that clock clips pretty fast, and especially if you're dealing with FHA or VA buyer, those things you may even need, for the VA buyer, you may even need a little additional time, unless you have a lender that has is able to submit direct, and that speeds it up. So for those types of lenders, you probably want to ask your, and I can't remember what it's called right now, I should remember. You remember when certain lenders, just like you have direct lenders, you have certain lenders that are direct for VA, where they can submit the paperwork and get the approval back quickly.
Direct endorsement.
Yeah, direct endorsement, thank you. So you want to consider those. Anybody have any questions about that? Okay. Additional financing terms, if there's anything that didn't get addressed in the upper section, then you can put it there. If you have any nuances associated with your particular buyer, and you put it there. And then the balance of the down payment, whatever wasn't in the initial deposit, the additional deposit, then that would be the balance of the money that will be due.
I do have a question.
Yes.
If I want the seller to pay the buyer's points,
Yes.
where do you usually put that?
Oh, okay. If you want the seller to pay the buyer's points, then I would put that in the additional financing terms. Okay, thank you for that. That's a good question.
And how will you word it? How do you word it in your contract?
You want to address that, Michael? How do you guys normally word that?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah, how will you word it?
Okay, then what I normally do is I say then that the seller will pay, and there's various ways, but I would say the seller will pay, and whatever the amount is that you want to pay, 1% of the buyer's either closing costs, loan costs, you can say non-recurring costs, recurring costs. It depends on what, if you want to make it where the buyer gets it regardless of what the cost is, then you say just closing costs. You don't specify recurring or non-recurring. Do you have any other, anybody have any other?
Pretty much it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's page 1 of the contract.
Yeah.
Yay! All right. How we doing on time?
Doing good.
Okay, great. Okay, so verification of down payment and closing costs. Well, if you were representing a seller, then of course that's very important to you because you don't want your seller to take his or her property off the market when you have a flaky buyer. So the best thing that we can do is when we're representing the buyer is with the offer, provide the verification of down payment. If you don't provide it with the offer, then you can check the box that say you have up to 3 days to get it in. But of course in the market where the inventory is low, it's very competitive, the more that we can put out there to make our buyers look stronger, the better off we are. So, keep that in mind. The appraisal, contingency, and removal. So the appraisal contingency is 17 days, and the loan contingency is 21 days. And that's, it used to be the same day. So they got smarter to recognize, well, it's hard to close the loan, and we're already pushing, because you know it's already tough to get everything done in the time that you have. But to give enough time for the appraisal to come in, to be evaluated, go through the process, and then actually get the loan approval. So, so the process has been changed to add that, which is good.
Hey Denise, can I ask something?
Yeah.
I just thought about something, guys. When you, I'm gonna go back to the closing costs. Sometimes, does everybody here know what buy down is? Okay. What a buy down is when the seller is paying for the buyer to get a lower interest rate. Okay? So therefore, if the seller is actually paying for a buy down, then in your financing terms, you want to put that specifically. Seller will pay 2 points to help buyer buy down the interest rate. The reason you want to do that, if you just put closing costs, then it's just arbitrary. You guys follow what I'm saying? So you want to be very specific, because with this new trend going on, it may get a little sticky when it comes to closing the transaction. You don't want any hiccups. So if the seller is actually buying down the buyer's rate, you want to put that very clearly on the document. Seller will pay 2 points toward the buy down of the buyer's rate. Okay, thank you.
How do you handle it when there are situations when the buyer has a rate lock, for example, and let's say the rate lock expires because of something to do with the seller? That's not a condition of the offer, but that does create a problem for the buyer, because who's going to cover that? So those are things that actually a little bit later on we can address, but those are things that also come up in a transaction. Rate locks, yeah. Okay. Loan terms, loan application. We all know that when we submit the offer, we need to have a pre-approval letter, and those letters used to be called pre-qual letter, now it's pre-approval. If they haven't collected paperwork from the buyer, you know, looked at the buyer's W-2s, looked at their tax returns, so that they can then qualify the income to make sure that the person does pull the credit report. You want to make sure that those things are done before, you know, with that pre-approval letter. So when we represent the buyer, we want to make sure that that's clear. When you represent the seller, our job is to scrub that package that comes in from that buyer's agent to make sure that everything is in order, because we don't want to have any problems for our seller to get down the road and then the buyer can't qualify for something that should have been known if the due diligence would have been done up front.
Okay.
Yeah. For loan contingency removal, we talked about that. Let's see. The sale of the buyer's property, that can be an issue. That's difficult in today's environment to get that accepted, because, like we talked about earlier, inventory is low, so why would a seller accept an offer from somebody who needs to sell a property before they actually submit the offer to the seller? So.
Denise, can we speak a little bit about the loan contingency removal?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I apologize about that. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So for the loan contingency removal, I'm sorry. Was there a specific?
Yeah. Who in here extends their loan contingency all the way to the close of escrow?
Oh.
Because you know, this is the clause that puts your buyer's deposit in jeopardy.
Oh, yeah.
You won't get accepted.
Yeah,
That's right, but who in here who's attempted to do that? No one, you guys just.
I've
Long
attempted
time.
to do that, and I've gotten it.
I've gotten it too. I've gotten it too. You know.
Not lately. Not lately, I gotta say not lately, but I've gotten it.
Hey, you guys asked for it, because if 21 days go by and there's a hiccup, your buyer's deposit is at risk. So, and it's defaults at 21 days, right?
Defaults at 21 days.
Right, so I
Yeah.
just want to let you guys know that. I'll put it in there, and sometimes it flies and sometimes it doesn't. Martine, you got any feedback on that?
I mean, I always leave it there. I always leave it there, but it's a proactive contingency from the seller side. So unless they enforce it, nothing happens.
Yeah.
So I just leave it the same way. I would not put to the life of the loan, because chances are they won't accept it.
Yeah.
So I have done it. I have done it, I have put it in there that, the same 45 days that were 30 days of escrow for the loan continues to stay there. And then most listing agents, or a lot of listing agents, don't look at it.
That's true.
And in the 17 days or 21 days of the escrow count, they'll call me and they say, you need to remove your contingency. And I said, no, I don't have to remove it. Now, when you use it, strategically use it to help everybody. Obviously, first your client, but not to, make things harder in the transaction. That's the one thing you have to know. But if they don't check it, they didn't check it. And I have to say, it was done on me too. That's how I learned. That's how I learned.
Anybody know the name of the document, though, if you are the seller and now you want to get the buyer to do something, when Martine was talking about the proactive? Does anybody know the name of the document then that you would submit, the seller would have the seller sign? Notice the buyer to perform.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So on that, what are the days? So if you have the 21 days, today's the 25th day, 21st day. If today is the 25th day, when do you have to give the notice of perform?
Oh, when do you have to? 2 days. Oh, when do you have to? You never have to. Yeah, if they don't give it to you, you just let it extend until they decide to tell you that, you need to do some paperwork.
So from either side, either from the buyer or the seller, if you have to give notice to perform to someone, and today is the due date, how early?
2 days prior to.
Yes.
You guys understand that? So where do you usually get it? When do you usually get it?
Oh, on the day of.
On the day off. So just know, if you get the notice to perform on the day off, which is the 17th day or the 21st day, you have 48 hours to respond.
And then they still have to file the notice of cancel. They're still
Exactly,
gonna
we should
take.
give you another 48 hours.
So, yeah, so you still do have room to do that. Thank you, that was good. I missed that. See, that's why it's good to have a knowledge base in the room. Okay, let's see. Was there anything else that I missed in that section? Good. Addenda and advisory. So we know that with the, if it's going to be a backup offer, sometimes the seller's already accepted an offer and you want your buyer to be in a backup offer, then you want to submit the backup offer form and you want to know what position you're in, so that then if the original buyer doesn't perform, then you know that you'll be the first one or the second one to step in that position.
Denise,
Yes.
on this market, how many of you guys submit backup offers? If you're not submitting backup offers, you're really out of this market, because I'll say 80 to a little bit over 80% of the first escrow is not closing. So here is the thing. If you have 5 competing backup offers and you are number 3 or number 4, but you're the only one that have this form, legally you're the only one that's entitled to actually being escrow in this particular transaction. If the other one didn't send this form, they just said verbally that they wanted to be in backup, the leasing agent could very well ignore you.
What form is that?
So that's the backup offer, is on 5A, the first square, BUO, backup offer.
Guys, I want to give you a little bit of experience real quick. That is critical, because I was a listing agent and I had 3 people who said that they was going to submit backup offers. They did, but only one submitted this form. And then when my deal fell out, everybody came out the woodwork and said, well, wait a minute, I gave you a backup offer, yada, yada, yada. But I could always go back and say, but this is the only guy that gave me the actual addendum. So it will save you if you're a listing agent and you have multiple offers. It will save you.
And if you're the listing agent and you presented the offers to your seller, okay, you presented, let's say, 5 offers, and he chose 1, right? And then the first one comes out of escrow, the first thing the seller is going to say, go back to the drawing board, get some of those people back. So the question is, how long do you need to keep your contracts or the offers that are written to you?
Oh, I normally keep them through the contingency period. So that's 21 days. Once we've gotten past that and the buyer has released all of the contingencies, then at that point we're sure we're going to close, or either the seller has a remedy because they're going to get the liquidated damages. I haven't done any deals with, where I needed the addendum for this septic well, or has anybody done any deals where you needed that? Oh yeah, I guess up in Palos Verdes and some other areas they do have, but please.
So nowadays, in pretty much in every area, because there's a lot of homes that are going on the market that normally don't go on the market, because there's a lot of areas that have septic tanks, but they don't normally go on the market. One of them is La Habra Heights. La Habra Heights, the minimum is 2.5 acres. They have 1 or 2 septic tanks, and you need to sell them. The seller needs to certify that the septic tank is working condition, that is not leaking, that is not, however you want to call it. But normally it's not on the contract. But you have to, by law, issue a certification that is working properly. Anybody else has a different experience? Those being the one with me. No.
And we're spending time on the addenda because you need to know what distinguishes us from everybody else, because everybody doesn't use them. Just like the short sale addendum, many of you probably have done that because there's been a lot of short sales out there in days gone by. If you just have some particular situation in which it doesn't fit in one of the standard addendums, then there's a blank form that you can write in what your particular situation is that you need to address to the seller.
Here's one. Do you guys know that there's an area in Bellflower that has septic tanks? Bellflower.
Really?
When you go to a listing presentation, how do I know? Ask Dima. He did an inspection for me. We thought it was regular plumbing. Guess what happened after?
The deal fell out?
No, it's a lot more than that, but it was a septic tank here in Bellflower.
Yeah, because I know there's something about leaching and all that other stuff on how it's supposed to perform, but I don't have really any experience in that. Okay, probate, we all know that if somebody dies without a will or, if it's not a living trust, which automatically passes, still goes to probate, but you have independent administration, so then they're able to sell, the heirs are able to sell the property without having to go through probate court for the confirmation and the overbid. Well, correct me, is there still a confirmation, there's just no overbid process? Because I think it still has to go to probate, but it's rubber stamped, so they don't need the
If you have a living trust, you don't go through probate. If you have a living trust, you bypass probate.
I know you, okay, I know that you bypass, but there still is, it still does go to that court, I believe, for rubber stamping or something?
I think she's asking whether it's a probate, but if it requires court confirmation or not. Is that's what you said, right?
No, I know with a probate, it requires court confirmation and the they allow for the overbid. When you have a living trust, I know that then you're able to, it passes automatically to the heirs, and so there's no requirement for the probate process as we know it. Not the difficult, but it still goes to the probate court, but it's transparent to us, I think. That's what it's.
No, that was, when there's a trust, a living trust in place, it has nothing to do with probate. It just goes to the attorney that is handling the trust and the executor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think what Denise is referring to, it has to go to the court process, so the rules of probate, when somebody dies, they still apply. The court really looks at, make sure that the decision, that whatever he asked for is actually granted, but you don't actually get to go to court. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. Okay, probate. Trust advisories. A lot of people have living trusts, and in that particular case, if the trust, the person's name is included in the trust, then typically you can identify the two people, so all of the requirements, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So with a trust, if a person has, you can have a personal property trust, but that won't be relevant here. Living trust, you can still do the representative capacity form, but it does not exclude you from some of the disclosures, etc. But I can't think of right now another type of trust that might be appropriate, if anybody else can think of some other type of trust. How are we doing on time?
You're good.
Okay, good. Statewide buyer and seller advisory, that covers everything that the buyer and seller needs to know about the transaction for the disclosures.
If you are not marking that in your offers, please, if there is one form you really need to review and cover yourself and the person you're representing is the statewide. Statewide is not an old form. It came out about 3-4 years ago, maybe 5 at the most. When this form came out, this is probably the only form that really helped us as professionals. It really helps you stay out of trouble because it makes every party on the transaction be responsible for what they're exchanging in this transaction.
Very good, excellent. And the buyer's inspection advisory, we all know that that's part of the contract package.
Yeah.
So we all check that that's by default, but yes, we want to make sure that we have all of those documents. Other terms, I mentioned earlier, potentially if you had multiple buyers, you could put that there. Any other examples that you guys use in other terms? Okay. Allocation of costs. Why don't we all stand up though before we go to the next session? I just need everybody to stand up and stretch out your arms or something. Make sure. Maybe you even give the person in front of you a little back rub or something. Make sure we're all together. It's a dry subject matter, but very important. Very, very important. Allocation of costs. Okay, so inspections, reports, and certificates. We all know that for the natural hazard disclosure report, typically the seller's going to pay for that unless the buyer chooses to. That's by practice. If there's a city inspection report required, typically the seller's going to cover that. Sometimes if you have investors, they may choose to, just not even check that or just cover all the costs on that because they want to get the seller to say yes, just let's get it done. Minimum issues and contingencies. If you have the termite inspection, termite inspection is typically paid for by the seller, but now, we have typically paid for by the seller. So that's another option.
That's a huge change in the contract,
Yes,
isn't it?
it is. So typically section 1, which were the things that are active infestation, the seller would pay for. Things leading to would typically be paid for by the buyer. So yeah, the first time I got ready to use this again, I said, well, where's the wood destroying pest addendum? Got it. So yeah, okay. So those are pretty much straightforward. Government requirements and retrofit. Smoke alarm, carbon monoxide, typically those get covered by the seller. And in LA, they have
9A.
The 9A
the 9A, thank you, the 9A report for the water conservation in the bars and those type of things. So, and it's important, that's, a lot of times those things don't get handled until the very end, but technically they're all supposed to be handled within the 17-day period. The seller should give you all that back. If the seller did not start the process in time, then it'll come typically later. Those are things that can be worked. I actually did close a transaction earlier this year. That was the first time that I had a company come in and do the certification. So now they have some companies up there that will do the certification for you. And we had we had the gas shutoff valve. It was a newer gas shutoff valve. But now this company wanted to get money. If that shutoff valve has expired and it was not a licensed plumber who installed it, then they want another shutoff valve.
You guys know what she's talking about?
Yeah.
There's different things. They have the shutoff valve, what else?
The bars for the windows.
The bars in the windows.
The water conservation for the shower head and the toilet.
Shower head in the toilet.
And
All the windows.
just the bar. Did I say bars
I
on
think
the
there's some parts of the lady ask you for the windows. If the windows are not high energy, whatever, you have to change it. This is retrofitting act in LA. Okay, and the reason I found out is because I couldn't close quite a couple of transactions. Actually, Halisa Lombardi and I became really close friends because the company she used to work for used to do all my retrofitting. Now it's owned by First American, so there's quite a few companies out there that do this, but just know there is quite a few things. However, you mentioned something. You can close a transaction if escrow and the seller and the buyer and title agree for the new buyer to take responsibility over it, especially if it's an investor.
Yes, absolutely. I don't have my phone here. Tanya?
Don't worry.
I'll let you know.
Oh, okay, very good. I'm conscious, it's like, I got 1 hour, 1 hour.
We have time.
Okay. Oh, okay, thank you.
I'll let you
Okay,
know.
okay, thank you. Okay, so retrofit, let's see. I'm gonna get through page 3. I haven't had any situations where the minimum mandatory standards had to be invoked, because most of the time the only thing we pick up is the items that are part of the government retrofit, and anything else gets captured in the repair area. So if the buyer, if the home inspector, the property inspector calls out something, then typically the buyer will address it in that section rather than there, in my experience. I don't know if anybody else has any experience. Escrow and title, customary for the seller to pay for, buyer and seller to pay 50-50. A lot of times, the escrow instructions are supposed to be out within 5 days. Sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. So we just need to be mindful of that. But we have an in-house escrow here, so that's good. Yes.
I have a question. I seen each pay their own fees. I have a question about also I seen in terms where each pay their own fees and 50-50. What's the difference? Is it a big difference on amount that you're paying, or?
They're both the same way. My experience has been they're both the same way of saying, both the same thing. So they just say it 2 different ways, but it means the same thing. Is that your experience?
I used to use the 50-50, but for best practices, now I put each party to pay their own fees. So I just think it's more appropriate to word it that way.
Very good. That's a good, I agree. Excellent. Okay, for title insurance, typically the seller's gonna pay for that. And I typically say, if I'm not trying to call it out, typically if I'm the listing agent, then even though we cannot dictate who, who the buyer uses for services, but a lot of times you'll see any reputable. I don't know, is there any other wording for title, escrow? You guys use any different wording other than any reputable? Unless you're calling out. My experience has been typically if I'm the buyer, I find it difficult to control escrow and title. Typically the listing agent wants to control that.
Yes, when it comes to, you can use, I use any reliable company as well, but I mean, it depends. If the property has a lot of offers, or typically you want to leave the listing agent that choice. That usually is typically the way it works. So I always leave it to the listing agent.
Okay, yeah, because we want to get the offer accepted, as long as we're not compromising our buyer's position.
Right.
Okay. Good question, Will. Home warranty. It's not wise to have, the buyer needs the home warranty. Buyer needs the home warranty. You got to do it. Oh, excuse me. Thinking buyer's inspection, sorry. For the home warranty, typically I always request that the seller provide a home warranty to the buyer. And most sellers I've found have been willing to do that because it keeps peace of mind for them too after the transaction closes, that they may not have disclosed something because something happens shortly after the buyer buys it, and they say, well, you really didn't know that? It creates, confusion. So I think the home warranty helps minimize the risk between buyer and seller in that area. Items included and excluded from the sale. Well, we know that everything that's attached to the property is called a fixture. All of that has to stay. So chandeliers, if somebody's got a pretty chandelier and they didn't take it out before they put the listing up, then it stays. For the personal property, for items included in the sale, typically the listing agent will put those in the listing, and then we want to make sure that we address them on the offer so that we pair it back, hey, these are the things that we expect to stay with the property. If we don't write it, then then we're at risk.
I wanted to go back to the home warranty, not to forget to add sometimes the roof, because it's key if we don't add that. And it happened to me that I added the roof and the pool, but I didn't include the AC because the house was not old and it broke.
Could you repeat that again?
Yeah, very important about the home warranty, to specify and check off the other items, because I usually add the roof, because it's very expensive. In this particular property, I added also the pool, but I didn't include the air conditioning system, because the house was pretty new, and in the first year, it broke. So, to have a happy client, be aware about these items, are
Yeah.
key.
That's a great
Yeah.
opportunity. Yeah, because roofs are expensive.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have something to say on this one. Before, I remember the home warranties would usually include the roof as part of the package, but now they don't. So definitely it's very important to include it. And nowadays, I go in and put in the most expensive plan, because it's I go up to $550, $600 up to the home warranty. And the way I sell it to either the buyer or the seller, say, look, this is your peace of mind, and chances if it happens, you'll be so glad that you got it. So, and mostly you're not gonna get a opposition versus going $300 to $500. There's been cases where we as the listing agent pay the difference just to get the upgraded, because it does come in handy.
Good point.
And even as a buyer's agent, if the seller doesn't want to pay the highest and they want to go with the medium, we can cover the difference, because it's key.
It's a good investment. Okay, very good. Okay. The other thing is leased and lean equipment. We know with all of the programs that have been out there over the last couple of years for energy efficiency, so when you have the solar panels on the roof, even water softening systems, other things that that may transfer with the property because they get leaned. In the early days, sellers didn't understand that when they got those solar panels, et cetera, there was a lien on the property, so when they got ready to refinance or do other things, they had problems. But now, I think everybody's kind of informed that if you have those type of products, solar panels, the water softeners, and things like that, then we need to make sure we get that leased information during the disclosure period from the seller, so that our buyers have an opportunity to look over that and decide if it's something that they want to keep or do. Items excluded from the sale, same, just like what's the, if you, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. If there's anything that will not be included, you need to put it here when you're representing the buyer. If there's, but typically we just want to deal with what's included. Can't think of anything else on that side. Brackets and attachments to walls, that's always a big deal. Typically, if it's something small, because like people may be taking flat screens off the TV and those kind of things, and they're going to leave little damage. So we always do our verification of condition to make sure everything. But there's going to be some little things that just they happen, and you just have to kind of work with that. But let's see, furniture. Oh yeah. So anybody else got anything else to add about
I have something to say, and I think it's almost time, but. First of all, I wanted to thank you for stepping up and going over the contract, because this is so important, guys. This is your presentation. So, especially in a competitive market that we have right now, I get to, on my listings, I get to see 4 or 5 offers. And I could tell right away the agent that doesn't know what they're doing. And guess who I'm going to work with? The people that specify everything, that gives me a clean offer, and that they know what they're doing. So, see, a lot of the times when you're out there competing in this marketplace, the other agent doesn't know you. The only way that they know you is by what you present. So, first of all, have a good presentation with your offer, a clean offer where they're not calling you on your mistakes. And the other thing I usually have nowadays, I have my lender introduce call them and introduce themselves. So this is very critical, and more than anything, I wanted to thank you for stepping up, okay?
You're welcome, thank you. Okay, very good. To
All
be
right.
continued.
Don't leave, that was great. I've been telling you guys that it takes a lot of effort to be here in front of people, and I want to commend you for that. I know it's not easy. And the one thing, this is not the sexiest part of our business, just like Martin said, right? We have a lot of things that are sexy, like the gatherings and the closing and the opening and the escrow. But understanding all this writing in here is not the sexiest thing in the contract. But guess what? It was an immense silence in here earlier. And she thought we weren't paying attention, but you know what? We were, at least myself, I was thinking, crap, I really need to review this contract again. Okay, and I hope all of you guys are with me. And on that, the better we get at this contract, I took 3 months to understand this contract, by the way, when I first got my license. I was with Bruce Mohern. He will not let anybody in the agent go on the field unless they understood this contract. That's how long I go back. Okay, so again, this is not the sexiest part, but you brought the sexy back. Thank you so much.